Jomo Kenyatta was born in 1891 in Kenya. From a young age, he was involved in the town of Nairobi. Kenyatta witnessed the return of African soldiers from World War I, men who had seen that European armies were not invincible. Their experience, coupled with land shortages among Africans, particularly galling as European settlers dominated the fertile tracts in the interior, produced protests among the Kikuyu, who in many instances had become workers on the Europeans' farms. He quickly became involved with the Kikuyu organization. This organization was one of the country's largest tribes and was very well developed. They had educated members that adapted European ideas of democracy. The Kikuyu tribe was the face of nationalism in Africa. This group was heavily repressed by the British and much of their land was taken over. Kenyatta became an elite member of the Kikuyu and adopted the role of fighting British colonialism. His father was the leader of the Kikuyu agricultural settlement. At about age 10, Kenyatta became seriously ill with jigger infections in his feet and one leg, and he underwent successful surgery at a newly established Church of Scotland mission. This was his initial contact with Europeans. Kenyatta later joined the first African political protest movement in Kenya against a white settler-dominated government, the East Africa Association, shortened for as the EAA. One of the EAA's main purposes was to recover Kikuyu lands lost when Kenya became a British Crown colony in 1920. In 1925, the EAA disbanded as a result of government pressures, but reformed as the Kikuyu Central Association, shortened as the KCA, and Kenyatta became this organization's general secretary. Between the 1920s and 1940s, Kenyatta worked on developing the Kikuyu tribe by promoting education and British opposition. He strengthened the tribe's political power in Kenya. During his political career, Kenyatta took many steps to help Kenya gain its independence from Great Britain. In 1951, grievances against the colonial distribution of land came to a head with the Kenya-Africa Union, demanding greater representation and land reform. When these demands were rejected, more radical elements came forward, launching the Mau Mau Rebellion in 1952. On the 17th of August in 1952, a state of emergency was declared, and British troops were flown to Kenya to deal with the rebellion. As both sides increased the ferocity of their attacks, the country moved to full-scale civil war. This Mau Mau crisis had forced the British government to realize the futility of continuing the evolution of Kenya through the existing colonial government. The colonial office took a firm direction in moving the country toward independence through a series of new constitutions in 1954, 1957, and 1960, which were designed to increase African participation in governing their homeland. On January 12, 1962, Kenyatta was elected to the Kenyan Legislative Assembly to represent the constituency of Fort Hall. On April 10th, he agreed to serve in a coalition government as Minister of State for Constitutional Affairs and Economic Planning. In the 1963 elections, Kenyatta led his African National Union Party to victory. Kenyatta was invited to form a government and became self-governing Kenya's first prime minister on June 1st. He took steps to reassure the European farmers about their future and also appealed to the freedom fighters and members of the Mau Mau to lay down their arms and join the new nation. On December 12, 1963, Kenya became the 34th African state to gain independence. The Duke of Edinburgh was in attendance as the colonial flag was lowered at midnight and the new Kenyan flag raised.
There were many factors within Kenya that led to the eventual uprising of Kenyatta's regime. Kenya was first colonized by Great Britain in the late 19th century. White settler communities wanted control over their destinies and formed the Legislative Council, the council which African communities had no representation in. This lack of representation, coupled with economic inequality, led to the birth of many pro-African political organizations. Through these organizations, Africans learned about the effectiveness of organized resistance. They became more aware of themselves as a distinct ethnic group and discovered the weaknesses and heterogeneity of the whites. The main goal of these organizations was to gain greater educational and economic opportunities for Africans. The first major national movement for one of these organizations was during the 1920s, although the leader of this movement was arrested and exiled by colonial authorities. By 1940, a ban was placed on most African political organizations. However, their pressure was still felt. Eliud Matthew was nominated as the first African unofficial member of the Legislative Council. This was evidence of what could be achieved through a well-coordinated countrywide organization. By 1944, the Kenyan African Union was formed as to foster the social, economic, and political interests of Africans in Kenya, and it gave Africans unofficial representation as well as helped unite the African people.
in those days, white settlers or white people were not happy to see Africans try to improve their way of life. And considering my brother, he was one of those people who had their early education, who could read and write, and with understanding, if not a university education. And he was looked on amongst advanced or educated people.
All of this resistance sort of culminated with the Mau Mau Revolt, which was an African revolt against the colonial government in Kenya. The government's reaction to this armed struggle made it clear that the resistance was having its effect. African political leaders were imprisoned and detained, and it forced colonial administration to lay down framework for independence, which allowed a limited, multiracial government. Overall, the armed struggle resulted in the death of about 13,000 Africans, mostly from the Kikuyu tribe. All these events paved the way for future political leaders in Kenya, like Kenyatta. The legacy of Kenyatta's regime is both polarizing and controversial. After serving his first term as president, he ran unopposed in 1966. After being re-elected, he expanded the constitution to bolster his power. Under Kenyatta, his party, the KANU, was essentially the only party in Kenya. His leadership was authoritarian, and his security forces were suspected for murdering prominent personalities deemed as a threat to the regime. During the 1969 election campaign, he banned the only opposing party, the KPU, detained its leaders, and ran unopposed once again. After the 1970 elections, Kenya was essentially a single-party state until his death in 1978. After his death, Kenyatta's mistakes resonated for many years to come. Because he failed to unite Kenya ethnically, it remains to this day a confederation of rivaling tribes. Also, because of his favoritism towards the Kikuyu tribe, the tribe he grew up in, it caused them to form an exclusive wealthy class. This has also blocked reform and change within the government and progressive leadership. However, his regime did do a lot of good for Africa. Kenyatta's regime was credited with leading Kenya to independence from Great Britain. He turned Kenya into a reasonably productive capitalist country with its moderate and anti-communist economic and foreign policies, which helped develop a strong middle class. Under Kenyatta's regime, Kenya was admitted to the UN, and he was able to keep the country generally peaceful and stable.